Welcome to the Bible Forum. Iran is back in the news. I wanted to share some background material and some information relative to Iran. Vice President Pence called on European and Mideast countries to join the United States in leaving the Iran nuclear deal at the Middle East Conference in Warsaw, Poland, just last week. The question becomes why? In large part because these nations are making nice with Iran in order, in his words, to create schemes to break U.S. sanctions. So, what is Iran, and what are their goals? The Gladstone Institute has written a report on this event. Goes back to a little while back, not too far. But they claim that on February 10th, 2019, the Iranian regime officially celebrated the 40th anniversary of the day it seized power. The fundamentalist and Islamist party of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini surprised the international community and the Iranian people when in 1979 it hijacked a revolution. The successful power grab sent waves through the global politics. Former king, the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, was supported by both Russia and Great Britain, replacing his father as the Shah of Iran in 1941. The Shah saw himself as heir to the kings of ancient Iran, Persia, and in 1971 he held an extravagant celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. In 1976 he replaced the Islamic calendar with an imperial calendar, which began with the foundation of the Persian Empire more than 2,500 years earlier. These actions were viewed as anti-Islamic and therefore resulted in religious opposition. The Shah's regime suppressed and marginalized its opponents with the help of Iran's security and intelligence organizations. Relying on oil revenues, which sharply increased in late 1973, the Shah pursued the goal of developing Iran as a mighty regional power dedicated to social reform and economic development. At the same time, he continually sidestepped democratic arrangements and refused to allow meaningful civic and political liberties, remaining unresponsive to public opinion. By the late 1970s, the Shah was reigning amidst widespread discontent caused by the continuing repressiveness of his regime, the social economic changes that benefited some classes but did so at the expense of others, as well as the increasing gap between the ruling elite and the disaffected populace. Islamic leaders, particularly the exiled cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, were able to focus this discontent with a populist ideology tied to Islamic principles and calls for the overthrow of the Shah. And the Shah's government did collapse, but it collapsed following widespread uprisings in 1978, 1979. Consequently, an Islamic republic succeeded that regime. Based on advanced cancer, the Shah left Iran in January of 79 to begin a life in exile. He lived in Egypt, Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, before coming here to the United States for treatment of lymphatic cancer. His arrival in New York City led to the Iranian takeover of the American embassy in Tehran by so-called students of Imam's line and hostages of more than 50 Americans, including those in our embassy. Held these folks for 444 days. If you were around and alert and paying attention, you know that on the very day that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president of these United States, these Americans were released. Their aircraft landed on the day that he took office. Although some people were aware of the intentions of the Islamist party, many underestimated the extent of its organizational skills and power. To harness both the trust and loyalty of the people, the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers initially portrayed themselves as spiritual people who had no desire to rule the country. Many, including several political parties, also believed that during a transitional period, the ruling mullahs would relinquish any power they had gained. However, as the mullahs began to generate support, they sought to gain even more power, reaching out to other social groups. Khomeini's radical followers assured people of different faiths, such as Christians and Jews, that their safety and concerns would be a high priority once the new government was put into place. These often neglected groups responded positively to the promises. When a delegation from the Jewish community visited the founder of the theocratic establishment before the revolution, Khomeini, assuring their safety, famously issued a fatwa stating, in the Holy Quran, Moses, salutations upon him and all his kin, have been mentioned more than any other prophet. Prophet Moses was a mere shepherd when he stood up to the might of Pharaoh and destroyed him. Moses, the speaker to Allah, represented Pharaoh's slaves and downtrodden, the Mustafazin of his time. Moses would have nothing to do with these Pharaoh-like Zionists who run Israel, and our Jews, the descendants of Moses, have nothing to do with them either. We recognize our Jews as separate from those godless, blood-sucking Zionists. There you go. The Ayatollahs also told other religious minority groups that they would receive protection. Quote, in Islam, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians are all accepted as equal unless they become a fifth column for foreign meddling in our country. Jews are accepted as Jews, but not as defenders of Zionist aggression. It therefore became a shock to those who had put their faith in Khomeini's radical party that soon after its rise to power, these guaranteed protections quickly evaporated. The Ayatollah began pursuing an Islamist agenda. Sharia law was imposed word for word. Death to America, death to Israel became statements chanted through the most influential offices as well as in the streets. Whoever stood up against these harsh and vague laws often faced the ultimate consequences, which were swift and unquestionable executions. The head of the Jewish community, a businessman and philanthropist, was executed immediately. His granddaughter writes that the execution had taken place after a 20-minute trial on trumped-up charges. His murder sent a strong message that under the new Sharia system, other religions would not be tolerated. The rule of law was out the window. Persecution of Christians, Baha'is, Sunnis, and other religious and ethnic minorities were ratcheted up. One of the regime's worst mass executions of political prisoners took place when approximately 30,000 individuals, including children and pregnant women, were executed within a period of 4 months. According to a U.S. congressional condemnation, quote, prisoners were executed in groups, some in mass hangings, others by firing squad with their bodies disposed of in mass graves. Some thought that the radical leaders of Iran would become more moderate over time, but 40 years later, the regime has increased its violence and become even more aggressive, both within Iran and outside. Due to its glorification of violence and the encouragement of hatred and intolerance, terror and malicious groups such as Hezbollah were formed. Iran made efforts to cooperate with Al-Qaeda, and to this day consistently trains and supports many other militant groups. Iran has been declared the top state sponsor of terrorism year after year. The Islamic Republic and its Sharia laws are now a global threat. Khomeini's regime also still scores highest in the world when it comes to executing people per capita. According to Amnesty International, Iran leads the entire world in the number of children it executes. Despite hopes that the violence and hatred would eventually diminish, instead, during the last 40 years, the regime's promotion of anti-Christian, anti-Semitic sentiment has continued to spread and to grow. Even more surprising than Iran's flourishing indifference to the rule of law is that some Western politicians and governments have attempted and are still attempting to appease this inhumane regime. Former President Obama led the charge to lift 4 rounds of established UN sanctions against the ruling mullahs, and famously, with no quid pro quo, reportedly gave the mullahs at least $150 billion cash. Under Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, Iran and Hezbollah were removed from the list of terror threats to U.S. interests. He also sidestepped sanctions to give Iran secret access to the U.S. financial system. The mullahs, not surprisingly, used it to promote terrorism, to fund their Islamic Revolutionary Guards, and advance their aggression. Currently, the European Union is trying to come up with new mechanisms to circumvent U.S. sanctions and make it easier to continue trading with Iran's regime. 40 years of the Iranian regime should be a sufficient lesson for the international community to make clear that appeasing the Iran leaders will do exactly nothing, either to protect the people of Iran or the global community. Concessions for the ruling mullahs only translates as weakness. They will seize any opportunity as an opportunity to increase their power. The only language to which fundamentalist regime will respond is economic, political, and if necessary, military pressure. As long as powerful governments continue to coddle the current regime, eruptions of violence and crimes against humanity will continue. Will the global community just stand back and do nothing for another 40 years? Our own President Obama gave us a hint with the billions that he sent without congressional knowledge or approval that that's where the liberal wing of our nation wants to go. President Trump, on the other hand, wants to isolate Iran and keep them weak in order to protect the Middle East from being overrun by Islamic radicals. Something, by the way, the Bible indicates will happen. It will happen during the Great Tribulation, which is probably not that far off. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. There's some surprising issues here that might change our opinion as to the timing on this. Not making it farther out, but bringing it just a little bit closer. Stay tuned.